Welcome to the Melbourne Property Podcast, hosted by Sky and Lindsay Hammer from Convergence Buyers Agents, your local property experts.
This podcast is your go-to source for insights, trends and tips on navigating the ever-changing Melbourne property market.
Whether you're buying an investment property or your dream home, stay tuned for the next 30 minutes as we give you exclusive insights that will shape your next property purchase. Let's dive in.
Hi, I'm Sky and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Property Podcast. Now, this episode is a must for all investors. I'm super excited about this one. We've got a special guest in the studio here today. If you're someone that's looking for that extra cash flow or you're struggling with your serviceability, then this is definitely a episode for you. So we'll leave it there for now and we'll crack into it. But Lindsay, how are you today? Are you doing well?
I'm doing well because our special guest that we were about to mention brought coffee with him today. So that always makes my day goes a lot smoother. As we all know, I love a good coffee.
And to kick things off, we do have a little message from our sponsor. So today we are sponsored by Scale Lending. Whether you're a seasoned investor looking to scale your portfolio or a growing family buying your next home, the team at Scale Lending takes the time to understand your strategy and structure your finances for long-term success. With access to over 40 lenders and a deep focus on property investment, they're not just ticking boxes, they're unlocking doors. So if you're ready to take your next step, visit scalelending.com.au and submit an inquiry and the team will reach out. Right, now back into it. Today, I'm super excited that we have, let's call it the self-proclaimed, essentially, Granny Flat King, Theo from Innovista Group. Theo, how are you today?
Good, mate, good. How are you all?
Yeah, doing pretty well. Yeah, can't complain. Super excited for this episode. As I mentioned, it's something that obviously Granny Flats in Melbourne is something new, relatively speaking, compared to some other cities across Australia. So keen to break that down. I know we've done some work together already. There's lots of potential in the Melbourne market to add some Granny Flats and boost that cash flow. But I think for now, maybe just a little introduction, a little bit who you are.
Sure.
We'll take it from there before we jump into our icebreaker.
I was going to say we could start with the icebreaker.
All right, sounds good. Do you want to kick things off?
So I don't know if you know Theo, but we do a little thing where we talk about what we're loving about Melbourne right now. This is, of course, the Melbourne Property Podcast. So what are you loving about Melbourne?
For me, probably two things. I would say one being sentiment. Sentiments change in waves, I've noticed, over the last 4 to 8 weeks specifically. I'm sure you guys have seen it on the ground. I've seen it myself. So that's always good to see. The other thing would probably be, we've kind of talked about this before, the small teasers and weather that we get to remind us that spring is on the horizon. So we've had that a couple of times in the last few weeks and hopefully it becomes a bit more prevalent.
We do talk a lot about the weather on this podcast, and I'm guessing it's because it's the Melbourne Property Podcast. So weather focuses heavily.
100%.
And what about yourself?
I am actually loving the cheap airfares out of Melbourne at the moment. So weather related as well, making the most of heading up to Queensland, seeing some family and warmer weather. Yeah, we went up to Townsville a week ago and it was 29 degrees, could go to the beach. It was amazing.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to be a bit more positive instead of everyone trying to get away. For me, it was actually the Mornington region. So I know we talk a lot about down that way from property investment perspective, but I think we're seeing more and more what there is to do out there, particularly if you've got young kids. We're at Dinosaur World on the weekend, which is a great place. If you haven't checked that out down near Somerville, I would highly recommend. Just a lot of farms, nice wineries. The weather's almost at that point now where they're back on the table. So
I have a fun fact as well for those listeners that don't know. My granddad actually discovered a dinosaur, the Mudabarasaurus, and it is featured at Dinosaur World on the Mornington Peninsula.
You know, I had this crazy career choice when I was about 9 years old, and I was just hard set on being a paleontologist.
Yeah.
Never ended up eventuating. I still love everything related to dinosaurs. Still watch things about dinosaurs, read things about dinosaurs several times a week. So that's something I really enjoy. And my daughter's only 6 months, right? And she's got probably every dinosaur book and toy that you can think of.
She will love dinosaurs.
She will 100%.
Yep. Yeah, there you go.
I was pretty similar, but I feel like my expectations were unrealistic having a granddad who actually discovered a dinosaur. So
big shoes to fill.
Big shoes for sure.
All right, today seems to be the day we're going a little off topic, but anyway, so let's jump into it, Theo. So just want to hear a little bit more about yourself. Just give our listeners a bit of maybe a background as to who you are, where you've come to and what you're kind of focusing on now, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. I'm a property developer. Been doing property development now probably well over 20 years. Got experience doing development across 3 states, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. New South Wales predominantly pre-2015 and then post-2015 I moved to Melbourne and doing a lot of that sort of stuff here. In Sydney and Queensland, there was a lot of mid-rise, high-rise work that I had done, some townhouse projects as well. Townhouses aren't as prominent in New South Wales as it is over here in Victoria. Then moved to Melbourne, and Melbourne, same thing, continued with development, did a lot of larger scale townhouse projects, sort of that 10 to about 100 range. No real mid-rise, high-rise projects. Again, very different to Sydney's market. Not many apartments here, as we all know. Yes, I've been doing development for over 20 years now. Shifted my focus a little bit in 2020. So in 2020, I got offered to co-find a property technology startup with my then CEO. And he asked me if I'd do it. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? I love tech. I've always been interested in tech. And I said, I wonder what it will look like as a career. There was some property in there as well, which we found great. Did that for about 2 years. And then we pivoted into AI. This was in around 2021, 22, so pre-ChatGPT. The reason why we did that is that we started playing around with automated AI processes just to see what type of positive impact it'll have on our systems and processes internally. We found that it freed up so much of our employees' time. We thought, why don't we just utilize this as a standalone service and make it industry agnostic so it's not tailored only to the property vertical. So we pivoted into that. Throughout this whole process, because of my relationship with my CEO and co-founder at the time, I still manage everything related to our development projects. I just happened to do it sort of on the side and here and there. I found myself always, whenever a task came up that was development and property related, I would lunge at the opportunity to do it. And I'd forget about all my responsibilities being the director of a tech startup. And I found like that's just not where my calling was. And, I sort of broke away from it a little bit and kind of think, what am I going to do? I couldn't really work for anybody else. I'd always had relatively executive roles in development companies and construction firms. And so I wanted to open up my own business. My co-founder said, would you, pitch the idea to me? Let me see what you've got. I pitched the idea, post the idea, said, done. Let's be investors in it. I'll let you run the show. You go do what you need to do. I'll be a silent investor and hit the ground running. And so that's when Innovista was born. This was 2024, so last year. And one of the main things that I wanted to target was granny flats, right? And that's kind of a segue into how I got, the whole granny flat king title, right? But I wanted to focus on that market because when I was still doing development here, 2020, 21, and then 19 as well, I had a lot of people would come to us with sites and say, look, I've got a 500, 600, 700 square meter site. I'm looking to subdivide. I want to do townhouses, things like that. And with townhouses, there are certain site requirements you need to fulfill. 9 times out of 10, most of these small scale investors wouldn't be able to subdivide, not profitably anyway. And, my advice to them is, why don't you plonk a granny flat on there, right? And 95% of the time, the answer I got back was, what's a granny flat? And I said, a granny flat, like a small backyard house, a small second dwelling in your backyard. And they asked me, like, can you do that? We haven't seen anyone in the suburb have anything like that. I'm like, of course you can. It's Melbourne. Why wouldn't you be able to do it? Looked into it and realized, holy shit, you cannot do it. You can't do granny flats here. They had a whole different other designation, which we'll probably get into later on in the podcast. And so I always thought that if those laws were going to change, and I always sort of knew it was going to be a matter of when, not a matter of if, I'd make sure I bring, that Sydney granny flat model that's been so successful over the last 15, 20 odd years, and also interstate on top of that too, and then adapt it for a Victorian market. And then when the laws changed and the opportunity came up to start my own business, I said, hey, why not? And that's kind of how I got into granny flats. I suppose the granny flat king title.
I can see you've got a little badge there
I
as well.
I do. I thought this would be very fitting for the podcast.
Of course.
But that sort of came about towards the end of last year, going into this year. I had a lot of people asking me for advice about granny flats. No matter what question was thrown at me, I'd always have an answer because I understand granny flats really well. I've built a ton of them back in Sydney, and so I understand the market fairly well. It's just a coincidence that Melbourne's granny flat laws now are almost a carbon copy of what Sydney's were. In fact, it's actually a little bit better than Sydney's. It's probably the best in the country, I would say. But again, that's something we'll delve into later on so we don't get too sidetracked. And when I'd get asked for advice, they'd always tell me, oh, you're like a granny flat guru. I'm like, granny flat guru? I'm like, it doesn't really have a nice zing. I'm like, what about granny flat king? And they loved it, and that's kind of how I was born.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
And I guess on socials, we can find you as Granny Flat King as well.
Yeah, you can also find us under our company handle, Innovista Group, as well.
Great.
TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, the whole shebang.
I did want to ask then, so what exactly does classify as a granny flat?
So a granny flat, essentially it's just a non-subdividable small second dwelling, not too different to a dual occupancy. The main difference between a dual or a duplex rather is the whole title thing, right? So you can get its own title for a duplex For a granny flat, you can't. So you couldn't, I get asked this often, what if I just build a granny flat under the granny flat rules and then decide to subdivide later? It's not going to work because subdivision has to go through council. When council go and see that you've got a granny flat there, they're not going to give you a permit for it. They cannot be subdivided. But essentially the granny flat itself, it's just a second dwelling that sits on the same lot, so it cannot be subdivided and sold separately. It has to be self-contained. In Melbourne, the designation for sizing is 60 square metres. It differs from state to state, and sometimes within the state itself, it differs from locality to locality as well. Queensland's prominent for that one. But essentially, it's just a self-contained unit that you cannot sort of split from the primary dwelling.
I guess you maybe talk a little bit more about what's changed. Like I know, as you're saying before, Melbourne wasn't always a granny flat kind of location, and maybe even run some numbers and compare them to some, I guess, the number of granny flats being built per year and 100%. That type of thing.
Yeah, great question.
But I guess maybe what's changed recently and why is there such potential now in granny flats in Melbourne?
Prior to December 2023, I think it was the 14th of December, granny flats had a different designation. So the word granny flat, it's much like the word home. What does home mean? It's an apartment, it's a house, it's living under a bridge, it can mean anything, right? Same thing with unit, right? Unit, you can have villas, you can have apartments. So it's just sort of a colloquial term. Granny flats in Melbourne prior to December 2023 were called a dependent persons unit or a DPU. I talk at length about this on socials because it's an important point for buyers advocates. It's also a very important point for investors looking to invest in Melbourne, and I'll touch on why in a moment. But they're called DPUs. Now they've got the new classification of a small secondary dwelling or an SSD. The main differences between the two, and there's quite a lot of them, is that prior to December 2023, you could build a granny flat under a DPU, but it's exactly as the name is designated. It's a dependent person's unit. The person living in there has to be dependent on you, and it has to be related to you. So you couldn't plonk a family friend in there. You couldn't put a regular friend in there. They had to be related to you. They had to be dependent on you. So we're talking teenage children, elderly parents, someone with a disability that's related to you, illegal to rent out. It was not meant to have a kitchen, though barely anybody ever complied with that. Everyone just plonked kitchens in usually afterwards. And it could be really any size. You just sort of went to council, lodged your permit and see how you went. There's DPUs out there that are 80, 90 square meters. There are DPUs that are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever. So they had no real size designation. And one of the most archaic of all the laws that included, firstly, was it had to be a movable structure, could not be fixed. So when we say fixed, they had to have the ability to be able to take it off site. And worst of all, once you sell the property or the person that's dependent on you stops depending on you, so elderly parents pass away, kids become adults and no longer dependent on you, and you sold the property, you technically had to demolish it, right?
Wow.
So what this created was a product that people didn't want to spend money on, served a very, very specific niche need, and then didn't really add much value to the property because you can't rent it out. It's just essentially a glorified storage shed with a bathroom, right? That's essentially what it was. That was prior to December 2023, and lots of people built them, and it was for the specific purpose of housing someone dependent. In December 2023, the granny flat laws changed in Melbourne. So those laws that I talked about with the dependent persons in it, we were the only ones that had laws like that. The only place that would have been somewhat similar to us was probably South Australia. Outside of that, everybody else was very progressive as far as granny flats are concerned. When the new laws came in, which don't really have a designation, it's just called the Small Second Dwelling Amendment, and it's got its own little section in the planning scheme for it to determine how you build them and in what capacity. The main differences between it's limited to 60 square meters. Again, cannot be subdivided just like a DPU. It doesn't have to be movable. It can be a fixed structure. Anyone can live there. It doesn't matter if the person's dependent or not dependent, or related or not related. And the biggest kicker is that because it doesn't have to be demolished, depending on how it's designed and how it's partitioned from the land through fencing and driveways and things like that, it could add a lot of value to the property. And we've seen lots of precedents like that in places like New South Wales and Queensland. The differences between us and other states, so prior to December 2023, we were the worst in the country by far. Now we're probably the best in the country. So I talked slightly to this before. The reason why we're best in the country now is the limitations on things like sizes. It's more or less in line with the rest of the country. Most states are about 60 square meters. In Queensland, some places are 80, some places are 50, some go up to about 100. In WA, it's 70. In South Australia, it's 60 as well. So it's roughly about 60 square meters, give or take, and you're probably in the safe zone for 95% of the country. But where we differ is the minimum requirements. So in New South Wales, for example, you have to have a 450 square metre lot and you need a minimum 12-metre frontage or site width. In Victoria, there is no minimum frontage, so your block can be as narrow as you want, which is great because a granny flat doesn't have to be X meters wide. It can be as narrow as 4 meters wide, just to give you a half-metre walkway with the 3 meters designated to living and bathroom and bedrooms. So if you had a very narrow site but you had enough land, you could still plonk it on there. And also, there's the limitation on the site size is 300 square metres here compared to 450 in Sydney. And Sydney, prior to December 2023, were known to have the best granny flat rules in the country. So we've now probably surpassed them. But to sort of touch on your point, as far as numbers are concerned, so New South Wales builds about 5,000 to 6,000 per year. Queensland's probably close to about 3,000 per year. WA is about 2,000. Melbourne, we're at about 300.
Yeah. 300.
300. So we're 10 times less than most states, and some states 20 times less. So it begs the question, why, right? So the reason for it specifically is because of the planning rules.
Yeah.
If it had not been for that, it would have never been the case. To give you an idea on numbers, pre-2023, we were building on average somewhere between 50 to 100 DPUs per year. So since the laws have changed, which has only been about 18 months, it's already kind of 5-10x from there. So it's definitely gaining traction, but there's going to be a time delay between planning rule changes, public perception, education, and then implementation and build, right? The only other thing I'll sort of highlight with the changes in rules, which is really important, is the need for a planning permit. So no longer need a planning permit, assuming you tick those checklist items. Checklist items are things like zoning, residential zone, no overlays that will impact the bill. So it could be like flooding overlays, bushfire overlays, vegetation protection overlays, and things like that. Assuming you have those and you've got 300 square meters and your granny flat's under 60 square meters, 95% of the time you can go without the need for a planning permit. And just in case people don't know, as far as permits go, it's a 3-permit process, right? You've got your planning permit, you've got your building permit, and then you've got your occupancy permit. Those 3 are mandatory for any type of product you want to build on your block of land. By utilising the new small secondary dwelling rules, you get to bypass the first, jump straight to the building permit, which is essentially the permission to actually start construction. So lots of benefits, lots of changes, but again, flow-on effects probably are still going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now.
Yeah, and that's why I was actually really keen to get you on here, because I don't think a lot of people, particularly investors in other states, and like a lot of our clients, a lot of listeners to the podcast aren't actually based here in Melbourne, they're interstate. And so when we talk about with granny flats with them, they're like, yeah, we know that. And I was like, well, it's actually quite new here in Victoria. Yeah. So there's a huge window of opportunity, because I know I've sent you a few sites to look at for our clients.
Yes.
There's so many great sites available for granny flats at the moment, because they just have been untapped.
Yes.
I wouldn't say the same for like inner city Melbourne, where you're looking at townhouse sites that have been done over for years and decades.
Yep.
But for granny flats, there's heaps of opportunity still. And I think it's a really interesting time to be buying up those type of sites for clients. And as you mentioned, like we got a sign for a client recently in Cranbourne, Cranbourne West, paid less than $550K for it. It's only on 450 square meters.
Yes.
It's already almost a 5% rental yield, but we can chuck a granny flat on. Despite it being a pretty small size, I'm going to get close to that 7 or 8% rental yield all up, which for Melbourne is essentially
fantastic.
unheard of.
It's good for anywhere, really.
Exactly.
Not just for Melbourne.
Yeah. So lots of opportunity. So I think if to take nothing else away, it's when you're looking to maybe buy a site in Melbourne, have that in, I was going to say back of mind, but maybe front of mind, the potential to possibly add a granny flat.
It's probably also a good segue into talking about how can a granny flat add to an investor's potential returns.
So with granny flats, and I'll preface this with the whole disclaimer, not financial advice, etc. But nevertheless, when you're looking at it from an investment perspective, how I like to think about it is like this, and I've done a number of videos on this very topic on my socials as well. When you're thinking about a rental yield, right, for a property, there's going to be a floor. Right, when we're talking about a floor, there's going to be a floor in rental where no property is going to be listed for under a certain amount of money, right? Forget about the fact that the granny flat will be brand new. We find that rental floor is about $400 a week. Doesn't really matter what suburb you're in. No one's really renting anything under that unless it's a really, really small studio with no amenity and really sort of far out. If you know that you've got a floor, and you know what the construction price is going to be, and for most granny flats, it's kind of hovering around the $200,000 range, including GST. Some are turnkey, some are not. Will just depend on the fine print with every single builder. But if you know that your rent's about $400 a week, and you know your construction price is about $200K, then you know what you're kind of looking at as far as bare minimum is concerned. So we find that most granny flats, at the very least on a gross basis, are yielding double digits, usually about 10, 11% plus. Mm-hmm. Depending what suburb you're in, can really make those numbers skyrocket up, right? And also depending on the use. So if people are renting out the granny flat to a family, we'll get a different yield compared to, renting out rooms within the granny flat in, say, an area like Clayton or maybe Mill Park, where there's lots of universities and they've got student accommodation and things like that. In places like that, your yields, 15% and above on a bare minimum basis. Now, that's kind of just looking at the granny flat in and of itself. When you've got the primary dwelling as well, then you sort of have to match up what your mixed yield will be. But no matter how you look at it, if you're sitting at 3, 4, 5%, for the primary home and you haven't built the granny flat yet, we find often that once you install the granny flat, you're looking at somewhere between 6, 7, 8%, sometimes even more depending on the suburb. What you're renting out a granny flat for in Bentley or Bentley East or McKinnon or Brighton is going to be very different to where you're going to be renting something at maybe in Cranbourne or Hoppers Crossing or Milton or something like that. But no matter which way you look at it, your floor is about that $400 per week mark on a gross basis.
A lot of our clients and even people that reach out through the podcast are saying, look, I really want to buy Melbourne. Everything makes sense except for the yield. And it's like, can we get 5% anywhere? I was like, look, you can go Wild West and buy Melton and try and get somewhere like 5% yield. You're probably going to wait 2 or 3 months to get a tenant in, that type of thing as well. Or you could maybe pivot and consider a different suburb and that with the granny flat potential. So the combined yield, that mixed yield is quite appetizing for most people, I think.
100%, yeah. I think when you think about manufacturing a yield, right? Because there's many ways people can manufacture yields. You can extend homes, you can renovate homes, you can have a star performing agent, you could have a point of difference, you could be in a great location, whatever it might be, it doesn't matter. There are many ways to manufacture and increase a yield on a property. Granny flats are one of the best that are out there. It's been done thousands of times over in Sydney. It's been done thousands of times over in Queensland and WA and the rest of the country. Ultimately, if you're working with low vacancy rates like in Melbourne, I think we're at 1.5% and under for most metropolitan suburbs, because one of the I suppose the roadblocks, we'll call it, or the concerns that I get that I hear often is, but granny flats are relatively new in Melbourne. Like, how do I know if I'll actually make that type of rental? I just tell them at the end of the day, you're not taking on a high risk investment like NDIS or co-living or student accom or room sharing or something like that. You're just building a second house in the backyard. Forget the fact. Don't worry about granny flat. Just assume it's a detached duplex. You put a fence in between. No one's the wiser. What's the difference, right? It's not like when you title it as granny flat, everyone says, that's it, it's time for me to get a discount. That's not how it works, right? People at the end of the day, if they want to live in a suburb when the vacancy rates are really low, then they have no choice but to move into something like that. And as long as you're building a really high quality granny flat, and again, you've positioned it well on the site. You don't want it too close to the primary dwelling, for example. You want it to make sure it's got its own driveway in a perfect situation. You want to make sure it's got a decent side yard or backyard, depending how you position it. Once you tick those boxes, it becomes pretty much a standalone property without the headaches and hassles and cost of actually subdividing. So that's kind of something I try and get people to think about when they're thinking about granny flats, because it is a roadblock, and that's probably one of the reasons why we partnered with a national property manager to provide a rental guarantee. So, as far as I'm aware, we're the only granny flat provider and developer in the country that has a 5-year rental guarantee on our granny flats, and that is just supposed to give you confidence. And for most suburbs in Melbourne, the rental guarantee is over $400 a week. So at least you know that no matter what happens with a tenant, or no matter what happens on my investment journey, then there's a floor that I'm going to receive. And this goes back to what I was sort of talking about before.
Yeah, and it adds confidence to the product. And I think we've had similar questions as well. Is like, but if it's a new concept, like, are people going to live in it? And my commentary is usually like, look, remember, we are in a rental crisis. And if you're offering someone a brand new, and I've seen the product, very easy to live in type of product for $400 a week, there's not going to be many pushback on that. But it doesn't matter really which suburb you're talking about. You're talking 2-bedroom, fully self-contained. If it's got its own driveway, pretty hard thing to beat, that's for sure.
Correct, yeah.
I do have a question on capital growth though.
Yes.
So we've spoken a lot about how it can boost your yield.
Yes.
Does adding a granny flat also increase the capital growth for your property?
That's what I always call the elephant in the room, right? When it comes to granny flats, everyone does always say, but what about capital growth, etc. So how I like to think about it is like this. If you've got a property and you put a granny flat on there, if you're in a lifestyle location or you're in a really blue chip suburb,
say Brighton,
right? Say Kew, maybe even around Toorak and those suburbs, or Hawthorn. If you've got the land space for it, is a granny flat going to be the best thing to put for capital growth, right? You need to ask yourself that question. Answer for most cases probably is no, right? So there's a lot of great things you can do with the backyard. You can put an alfresco, you can put a nice beautiful pool, you can put a beautiful landscape, manicured garden, and put a fountain, put so many different things. that kind of ties back into what the perception of value is by the people looking to purchase the asset, right? If you know people are purchasing assets in blue chip suburbs, chances are they're probably not struggling as far as yield and finance is concerned.
Yeah.
They may have an elderly parent that they want to live with them, sure, but you're kind of looking for a needle in a haystack there in those type of suburbs. So typically for suburbs around the 5 kilometers or maybe 8 kilometers in towards the CBD, if a client came and asked me and said, I want to build a granny flat, and I ask them why, and they say for investment purposes, I'd have to sort of work out exactly what their strategy is, like what's their timeline, are they looking at holding this 5, 10, 15 years, etc. And then I might possibly suggest something else, right? But for anything, especially in the 10 to about 30 kilometer ring out, granny flats work great. And to sort of answer the question in relation to capital growth, we find that when you first complete a granny flat, and let's say you get it revalued, the valuation will come in somewhere, in my experience anyway, especially doing them in Sydney, they usually will come in somewhere between 0.7 to about 1 to 1, the cost that you put in for the granny flat. So if you've got $1 million property and the granny flat's $200K, the valuation will come in somewhere between 1.15 and maybe 1.2 million. That's exactly post-completion. Once it's complete and it's been rented out, usually we find that around the 3-year mark, 4-year mark, when the revaluation come in, the capital growth is where it accelerates. There was a report done by Cotality, which is CoreLogic previously, and they did it in collaboration with, I believe it was Domain or realestate.com, and they found that sites with granny flats often would have a 20-30% higher rate of capital growth than the same block, same house, same everything without one. So if your yield, let's say your capital growth rate's 5% per annum, with the granny flat you're looking at closer to 6%. The reason for that, and I think this is a trend that's probably going to continue accelerating over time and not going the other direction. The reason for that is that granny flats are probably some of the most low-risk, flexible type of assets you could own, because on the same block, you've got something that can be used for parents, you've got something that can be used for kids, you've got something that maybe you could rent out for additional income, you've got something that you can use as a place to downsize into in the future if you're already an elderly person. You could look at that as a low maintenance solution where you don't have to leave the suburb that you grew up in and worked hard to buy a property in, and you could move into the granny flat because it's, especially our granny flats are really sort of higher end, designed for that purpose. You could move into it with a low maintenance option and then be able to rent out the primary home, or maybe even put your kids in the primary home to give them the opportunity to stay close by if they've got grandkids and things like that. So we find that those reasons are only increasing over time. Multi-generational living is trending up. Older people are, we're talking people in their 30s and 40s, are moving back home at a much higher rate now than they were 10 years ago. Younger people are leaving the home much later now than they were 10 years ago. So the average age of people moving out of the house is about 25. 10 years ago it was about 19, right? And this is a trend that's only going to continue as cost of living pressures keep building and property keeps accelerating. I don't really see the property market cooling down and having a catastrophic crash where everyone's going to get back into the prices of the 1990s anytime soon. So with those trends being there, it's pretty logical to extrapolate that over time this is going to be a more in-demand type of asset. And because Melbourne is a pretty blank canvas as far as granny flat sites are concerned, it's something worthwhile to think about, right? Just one thing I will touch on is, especially for your viewers and listeners at home, be very careful acquiring a site with a granny flat already in Melbourne. Going back to sort of what we were discussing about DPUs, check out the contract. Make sure because a lot of solicitors also don't know this. So your solicitor is your first line of defense when it comes to legal due diligence. Sometimes they don't pick it out on contracts. I've seen this happen before with buyers agents I've worked with and with clients I've worked with directly. The idea is, well, why should I build a granny flat when I can just buy a house already that's got it on there and start making, dual income from day one? Great, sounds great in theory. In practice, it's very different. If you check the contract and you realize a building permit was issued before December 2023, if you buy it, you legally cannot rent it out, right? Because it's a dependent person. You weren't allowed to rent them out. When the laws changed, it didn't just automatically reclassify every DPU as an SSD. It has to comply with the requirements of an SSD. So we find that if someone wants to purchase a site with a DPU already on there and it's under 60 square meters and it ticks all the boxes of an SSD, it's a very simple conversion process with a building surveyor. They put a change of use application through, issue a new permit, and it's now considered an SSD, and you can get all the benefits of having a granny flat. Fantastic. If it's not, so let's say the DPU is 70, 80, 90 square meters, there's nothing you could do. You can't just trim off a couple of walls and re-put them in and say, hey, now it's an SSD. No council will approve it, no building surveyor will approve it. So you get stuck with an asset that you probably paid a couple $100,000 extra for the sake of making dual income. and then you realize you can't even use it for that purpose. So that's something important for I think people to think about.
Potentially also where minimum standards come in as well, because that was sort of 2021.
Correct.
These laws changed in 2023. So you kind of want something that is that newer asset that's going to encompass both of those things.
100%.
Whereas the older DPUs or the older granny flats probably don't meet those standards.
Exactly, 100%.
I think, to be honest, when we see them now, like any kind of property listed online, you see dual living potential. Like I know real estate agents have changed their wording to really kind of keep it open, I guess, but not to tie themselves down or limit people. But I don't know if I see something that's built on there. There's minimum standards now where you can just look at the photos and say, look, that's not going to meet it.
100%.
But particularly like when we're talking those 70, 80, even 90 square metre builds that you just know aren't going to stack up or get converted too easily. I basically don't even look at the property any further. It's just not worth it.
It's not worth it. Definitely not.
But you made some really interesting points. Like I think one of the main headwinds that like this granny flat potential was facing in Victoria has completely changed now. I guess from the legislation point of view, it's gone. And it's pretty much just all tailwinds now. Like as you mentioned, you've got older demographic. Lots of people I know, if anyone's looked into putting a parent into nursing home anytime recently,
yes.
$200,000 granny flat is a lot cheaper than some of the fees you have to fork out at the moment. So I think that's a massive tailwind coming. Rental crisis, again, that's not going away anytime soon, but also the multi-generational families. And for us, like I know we've spoken about this, that we actually really like the suburbs where kind of overseas immigration is quite high, or the demographic of that suburb is basically the entire family is built around looking after the elders as 100%. They get older. So I think in those suburbs in particular, because we've had some queries from clients being like, I've put a granny flat on, does that mean the future resale value is going to be impacted, or does no one's going to want to buy it in the future? But if you're in the right suburb, I think it only just adds to it because lots of people are out there looking for that type of product.
Just to add maybe one point to that. So if you were to build a granny flat, right? Let's say you're in a middle ring suburb, you decide to build a granny flat for the sake of increasing your yield, and you're thinking about capital growth somewhat. Maybe it's front of mind, maybe back of mind, doesn't really matter. You build it. You get to enjoy it for 10, 15 years. The granny flat's probably paid itself off twice over by this stage, depending where you are, could be 3 times over. And, all of a sudden your suburbs now become a bit of a blue chip suburb. Time has passed, capital growth's increased, etc. If at that point in time it's converted into a blue chip asset and people really don't want a granny flat in the backyard, just demolish it. Yeah. Demolition costs $20,000, right?
Yeah,
it's a spec compared to how much money you've made in those 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 years. So it's not really the end-all, be-all, because one of the biggest concerns I get is, but what if I want to sell in the future and there's a very limited buyer's pool because no one wants a granny flat in the backyard? Then I want to demolish it.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't cost a lot to demolish something.
Exactly. Particularly because maybe some of the old DPUs would be different, but it's not going to be riddled with asbestos or anything
like that. No, not at all.
Because it's a
very simple process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Could you talk me through some of the inclusions in your granny flats? Like what makes it so high-end with the specs and everything?
Yeah, so how we sort of designed our granny flats, I designed it the way that I would want to live in it myself, right? So being in property development now almost 20 years, I've learned a thing or two when it comes to design, what customers want, what people like. When I've handed over keys post-settlement and people walk in there, I get feedback, what they like, what they don't like, etc. I tried to incorporate that as best as I could with our granny flats as well, without keeping the cost sort of too high. Some of our standard inclusions will be things like 2.7 metre high ceilings, 2.4 metre high door frames. So with granny flats, you're limited in 2 directions, right? You either go X meters this way, X meters this way, because 60 square meters is your cap. So if you're limited in the X and Y direction, the only place you can go is up, right? And so there are no intrinsic height limitations when it comes to granny flats. You can build them at 3 meters, 5 meters, 7 meters, whatever. The only limiting factor in height will depend on the overlay. So if you're in a neighborhood residential overlay, maybe with a design and development overlay or a heritage overlay or something like that, there are limitations sometimes to about 5 meters in height. But otherwise, 5 meters are very, very tall granny flat. So we try and make use of the space going up, because when you're in a confined, smaller space, you need 2 things. You need additional height to open up the space more, and you need more additional light to come in so you could see the additional height, right? So we incorporate quite a lot of windows in our designs as well. We go with a very modern design when it comes to exterior elements. So cladding, we use a James Hardie Axon product, which is more premium-based cladding. It's also expensive. It creates a heavy structure, which creates room for the building to settle if it's going to be on a ground floor slab. So we go with just a cladding finish to the exterior. We try to make it as modern looking as possible. The feeling that I want to give off, right, is if I could just sort of take you on a bit of a journey. When you purchase a brand new car, right, you buy it, You go to the dealership, they make a big deal out of it, put a nice pretty bow on it. You're happy, you're proud, you drive it home, you're enjoying it. You park it in your driveway, get out, you lock your car, you walk to your front door. Before you walk inside your house, you always turn back and look at the car, right? It's almost subconscious. You turn back and look at the car and you've got a smile from ear to ear. The reason for that is because you're proud, right? That all that time and effort and finance and thinking that you put into it and you finally got it, you're proud of it. And that feeling stays for a long period of time, sometimes years afterwards. This is the feeling that I want to evoke in people that want a granny flat, right? Because it's sitting in your backyard. Chances are you're going to be able to see it from your house, from your primary home, from the window, from your backyard. I don't want people to see a granny flat that looks like, that stereotype of a shed with a window and a door built by bricks. And then you look out and you're like, oh, thank God it's, making me some money. Otherwise I wouldn't have that there. I want people to look at the granny flat and think, wow, this is such a beautiful, I could actually picture myself living in it. And we get that often with clients, especially from an older demographic, that once it's done, they say, I want to, I'm thinking about moving into it myself and just renting out the primary home because it ticks all the boxes. So that's the feeling we want to evoke. And to do that, we had to make a lot of upgrades to the interior. So ones I highlighted before related to height. Materials as well. We try and use sintered stone throughout. We want maintenance. Maintenance is very important to us. So we use sintered stone because it's super low maintenance. We use SPC hybrid floorboards because, again, maintenance is great and they're very durable. There's no carpets anywhere. I despise carpets myself. I don't like them, so I didn't incorporate them anywhere in our design. Our bathrooms are, the sort of the showpiece of the home. Our bathrooms will have a skylight as standard over the shower. We have a 1.7 meter wide walk-in shower, a frameless walk-in shower. We have all of our fixtures in the bathroom are wall hung, so nothing touches the ground. The reason why we've done that, again, I want you to be able to take a mop bucket, fill it with water, throw it on the ground and be able to mop wall to wall, right, without having to mop around edges of a toilet or vanity feet or things like that. Storage is another important one. We try and incorporate storage everywhere that we can as standard in our granny flat designs. So they're kind of the main things that people don't like in granny flats. We wanted to make sure we incorporate them as standard. So as far as a price point goes, we're not too far above many other people that have a far lower list of inclusion. So that's about 208,000 including GST. Again, I try and tell people, I made a video about this just on Saturday, right, is don't cheap out when it comes to granny flats. Doesn't matter if you want mine or anybody else for that matter. If you spend 180,000 or 190,000 or 200 or 210 on a yield of starting at about 10, maybe 11%, you're not really doing much to increase it, right? Maybe if you save 10, 20,000 on the build, you might increase the yield by 0.5%, maybe 1%. You're still in the double digits range. It doesn't really matter. What matters is resellability of the home with the granny flat in the future. You want to cheap out and save 20, 30 odd thousand bucks, you can do it, and then you build the granny flat. When you want to sell it in the future, and chances are a lot of other people are going to be building granny flats in the same suburb as you moving forward as well. If you do that and people have a choice between yours with the crappy granny flat and your neighbor with the nice granny flat, guess what they're going to pick, right? So, and 30,000, to be honest with you, when it comes to construction, it's not a lot of money. You can't even renovate a kitchen for 30 grand, right? Maybe you get away with a bathroom. So I tell people, try not to cheap out when it comes to granny flats because it'll pay you dividends later on down the track. And if you're loaning the money to build it anyway, doesn't really matter, right?
So that 208,000, that'll get you what, a 2-bedroom, one bathroom,
60 square meter.
60 square meter with a kitchen.
Correct.
Small living area.
Exactly.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, exactly right.
I know I'm looking at lots of sites at the moment. I'm mapping out, we have a few platforms, so I'm mapping out all the great sites in Melbourne. Well, not all of Melbourne, but a lot of good suburbs.
Yep.
Obviously, I know a lot of the key things to look for right now. Is there a couple of red flags you'd want to flag with our listeners? Because I know a lot of people obviously could try and do it themselves.
Yes.
What are the big ones to be aware of when you're looking at a site?
When you're trying to, I suppose, assess a granny flat site, even though the requirement from the government is that, as long as you're over 300 square meters of land size, you can, bypass the need for a planning permit, go straight to a building permit. In theory, yeah, fair enough. But in practice, 300 square meters is a very small amount of land, right? Yeah. So unless you've got an extremely small house positioned perfectly where it's set back maybe a meter or two from the front, and then you've got all this big backyard on a 300 square meter block, which 95% of properties don't, it doesn't really matter. So 300 square meters is not going to get you nothing. So you'd need to be looking at a site. In my experience, you'd want to be at least about 550 odd square meters. Anything less than that will depend on the orientation of the primary home relative to the lot. will depend on the lot shape. So, rectangular sites are perfect because you can make use of the square edges because most granny flats are rectangular in shape anyway. Otherwise, if you've got a odd shaped site, maybe with curves or maybe with, one boundary is maybe shorter than the other, for example, you just have to position it correctly on site to be able to make it fit.
Yeah.
You'd want to be at least 1 metre away from any boundary. So side boundaries and rear boundary, which is better than Sydney. Sydney's 3 metres from the back. Us, you could be up to as close as 1 metre. Even you could build on the boundary if you wanted to. Other things to look out for are easements. Easements are an important one. Depending who the easement owner or the asset owner under the ground is. So if it's someone like Melbourne Water, they typically want us to be at least 1 metre away from their easement. If it's City West or Southeast, or Yarra Valley, they don't really care, so we can build pretty much right up into where the easement is. You can also get a build over easement consent if you really want the granny flat, and the best position to put it is going to be over the easement. Will depend on what easement, again, it is, but it can be done. You just enter into a section 173 with council, which goes on title in case there's a massive blockage and it happens to be where your lot is and they need access to the area, then they have the right to break onto the property and do what they need to. But this is a standard requirement for any build over easement consent. So watch out for that. I'd say also, we've kind of touched on this before, in the contract, if there is already a dependent person's unit in place, double check and make sure it wasn't permitted prior to December 2023. Look for things like covenants as well. So covenants are something that it catch some people out.
We see that a lot in Carrum Downs where you'll get a site that looks great. You've got the space, no easements. You get the Section 32 and there's a covenant. You're not allowed to build any other dwellings on the property. If you do, they have to meet certain standards they have to be brick, for example.
Yes.
Really complicates things.
Yeah, I've dealt with a lot. Like I've removed covenants myself. So covenants are a bit of a funny one because they're not really, they're not enforced by councils 9 times out of 10. It's more enforced by the general public, especially if
nosy
neighbour, right? But if the neighbours are all in unison in terms of what they want, then usually it's quite easy to remove. So single dwelling covenants are an annoying one. I've removed them before in suburbs like Kew and Hawthorn. Again, it just required a bit of liaising with neighbours. At the time, most neighbours, owners had already changed hands to a younger, and maybe it was an inheritance or they've sold and a young person's moved in.
Yep.
They don't really care about covenants. They don't want them either because they want to be able to get as much value as they can from the land. So the covenants really kind of die with the generation that made it, we find.
Yeah.
There are other covenants like, brick covenants. I see that. I've seen that in Frankston North. I've seen that in areas of Hoppers Crossing. I've seen that in Carrum Downs. I tell people, probably best for your lawyer, right, to give you this advice. But at the end of the day, removing a brick covenant, it's neither here nor there. It can be done quite easily. I've analysed sites where it had a brick covenant and you look and it's got a garage that was built in the last 10 years and it wasn't even built with brick.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly, yeah.
So sometimes they're not worth the paper that they're written on. That's the honest truth when it comes to covenants, but it's still something to highlight and it's something that your lawyers will pick up most of the time. Other things to note are overlays. So ideally you would want to be acquiring a site that has no overlays at all, and there's a ton of them in Melbourne, so you don't have to. It's not like every site you pick will have some type of bad overlay, but ideally stay away from overlays. If you do have an overlay on there, just depends what overlay it is. Some overlays that trigger the need for a planning permit irrespective of everything else, every other criteria being met, are going to be your bushfire management overlay. That will trigger a planning permit. A land subject to inundation overlay or a special building overlay, they're flooding. Those are flooding overlays. They will impact it as well, but we're talking small impacts. But even if it does go to council and you do need a planning permit, sometimes you can still take it through the Vic Smart pathway, which is an expedited 10 business day pathway. So it's not really the end of the world. The only thing is additional costs for consultant reports that are required for those particular overlays. So watch out for overlays. Keep your land size about 550 square meters. Frontage, ideally you'd want to be about 15 meters as a bare minimum, depending what granny flat design you want. Our granny flats, for example, are 10 meters wide by 6 meters deep. So if you're going to have 10 meters wide, you need to be a meter off from the boundary. You're already at about 12 meters and you need some space for a backyard and for a side yard. Yeah. So 15 meter frontages we find work perfectly fine. And as far as locations are concerned, again, sort of granny flats don't really matter where you put them as long as, if they're in metropolitan Melbourne, it's not really an issue. One other thing to look out for, people get plugged up on, is slopes and elevations. They can be beneficial. So if you're on an elevated block and you've got a nice view of something and you have the granny flat there, can work out to be a beautiful design. Only difference is that on elevated and slope blocks, sometimes construction costs can be a little bit higher.
Yeah.
It sort of also makes things like concrete slabs a bit difficult. So for us, we do both concrete slab and stumps for our designs. But when you've got a sloping side or elevator side, there's lots of cutting and filling and things like that need to be involved to make way for a concrete slab. So for those sites, we recommend stump systems. So that's something also to consider. The only other thing I would say to think about is going to be finance as well. So how you finance a granny flat a little bit different to financing, a normal property acquisition. With finance, there's a number of different options available. So we find the most common are going to be an equity release. So if you've got a number of investment properties or you have principal place of residence, you've got equity you want to take out, you redraw the equity. Your broker will sort of work with you in terms of how to label the equity for the best thing to do. We find that when you mention the word granny flat, some lenders can be a bit hesitant. So brokers will sometimes recommend, label it as for renovation or something along those lines, and then you utilize the capital to build a granny flat. It's the most common way. Outside of that, you can get construction loans with second-tier lenders, so Latitude being one. What they do, they take possession of the entire property, then they fund you the construction. It becomes a construction loan. They fund you usually about 70-80% of the value of the granny flat. So on 200,000, you might be looking at 30, 40, 50 grand to fork in out of your own pocket. We find most people have that money sitting in an offset or something anyway, so it's not really a problem. We'll then go and get the building permit for you. Once it's issued, we take it to the bank. They value it on an as-complete valuation. Once that's done, then they lend you out the money. You build the granny flat, and once it's done, for us, it only takes about 4 months, 5 months tops to get in and out of the ground and hand you your keys to the granny flat. Once that's done, you can then refinance both assets, especially once the granny flat's rented out with a first-tier lender like CBA or Commonwealth. Or NAB or something like that.
So I guess those additional holding costs are something to factor in, but as long as you've got and this goes for investment properties as well, like second and third tier lenders are great as long as you've got an exit plan to get off
100%.
7-8% interest rate.
Exactly.
To move back to something else.
Going back to the holding costs, how long does this process take to build the granny flat, to get all the necessary permits, everything?
Yeah, great question. So it will depend firstly on whether a planning permit is triggered. So if a planning permit is triggered, the answer is how long's a piece of string, right? Depends with council.
Let's say we get that 10 days with Vic Planning.
Yeah,
let's go down that path.
Let's say, best case scenario, you via the planning permit route, you get it done in 10 days. Once you've got that done for us, once we've got the planning permit, getting the building permit thereafter can be as little as 7 days, can be as long as maybe 15 to 20, just depends. Our building surveyor that we use is very familiar with our product, understands the granny flats and small second dwellings really well, so we can do them in under 7 days. Once we've done that, a couple of days later, maximum 1 week, we're on site starting. Once we start, usually we find within 3 months we're done, 3.5 months or so, we're complete. It doesn't take an awful long amount of time, and our granny flats are not prefab or modular or anything like that. That is a whole other conversation because prefab and modular are great for some scenarios, not so great for others. Metropolitan Melbourne, we found prefab and modular don't work that great because of accessibility constraints and funding requirements as well. It's hard to get funding for prefab unless it's an Australian prefab manufacturer, and even still, it's a very unique type of loan facility that you need to get, and only some banks are doing loans for prefab. So if you're in regional, it's a different story. Regional, you have no accessibility problems. You can get a crane onto site and be able to sort of take it off the truck and plonk it where you want it. Usually we find regional works great for prefab and modular, and there's also a premium for building it traditionally because it's hard to get trades in certain pockets of regional Vic and hard to get materials out there and all the rest of it. So prefab works great for that, but for us, we just do traditional builds, especially in Metropolitan Melbourne. 4 months is usually our time frame.
To maybe wrap things up, put a bow on it, as you said earlier, but give an example, like maybe rough purchase price for a property, then adding a granny flat and what the numbers look like.
Sure.
A couple of success stories.
Yeah, of course. So I can give you two. So we had one client in Bentley East, purchase price 1.2, granny flat's about 210,000, just including some demo costs that they had on site from their backyard. Which is maybe something I forgot to mention. Think about also what's in the backyard. So if you've got an old shed, old carport that needs to be removed to make way, add those costs in because they're very specific depending on what site it is. So they were all in for just over 1.4-ish million. They rented out the granny flat. Last I checked with them, I think it was about $550 a week. So making a very tidy return on that one. Their plan is that they're going to get their family from Sydney to move to Melbourne sometime in the next maybe 5 to 10 years. And so they're renting it out for the meantime. And then when their parents come in, they want to have somewhere for them to stay while they establish themselves. So that was sort of their plan.
So that's their principal place of residence, and
Correct,
the granny flat's
yes. And they're
just
renting out the
on
granny flat
side?
in the back.
Yeah,
Exactly
great.
right. We had another one in Dallas, which is a pure investment play. So they bought a 580 square meter site in Dallas last year in May, paid $540K thereabouts for the site. Once they did, they wanted a granny flat to be built there as well. Built a granny flat for them. It's a corner block, so a beautiful spot. Corner blocks are great for granny flats because then you have your own independent access from the street. So we sort of just put a fence almost directly down the center. Primary home still has a small backyard, and then the granny flat kind of looks like its own property. When you see it from the street, you would never tell it's a granny flat. It just looks like an independent modern home. Built that for them just under $200K because they sort of wanted to skim out on a couple of different upgrades and things like that. So they're all in about $740,000, renting out the granny flat for $450 a week and renting out the primary home for $550 a week. So the primary home's a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom. Granny flat's a 2-bed, 1-bath. So they're making about $1,000 a week. So their mixed yield is hovering over 7%-ish on a gross basis. They're neutrally geared, not taking into consideration tax. Then with the granny flats, you can claim things like depreciation, which a lot of people don't actually know about because if it's an income-producing asset, which a lot of granny flats for investments are. And then, depending how you structure your loan facility, again, not financial advice, but when people that use debt recycling, for example, and then they utilize it for investment purposes, can claim all the interest deductions on the granny flat itself. We find that some people can get 15, 20, 25 grand back as far as tax goes. When they put that into consideration, you're positively geared to the gills, no problem. So that was a really good success story. We've got a number of projects under construction as well. The ones that are under construction now are predominantly owner-occupiers. They're doing it for their families. 2 for elderly parents, 2 for kids. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I think that over the next probably 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a strong push on the investor side of things as the case for granny flats as an investment is starting to sort of skyrocket in popularity. It's nothing new, right? People have been doing this for the last 15, 20 years in Sydney. So it's not like you're redesigning the wheel. It's something that works, but it just doesn't have too much legs here in Melbourne, but that will change over time.
No, hopefully that was some good numbers for our investors listening because it's not just, and the other thing I guess we're seeing with our clients as well is that it's not just about buying a house today, chucking a granny flat on tomorrow. It's the potential that let's say you don't want to do it straight away or you haven't got access to those funds. It could be 3 years, 5 years, it could be 10 years.
Correct.
But as long as you're thinking about the potential to do so when you're making that purchase, I think it's going to really set you up in that longer term for a really good cash flow play.
Yeah,
we do offer portfolio planning for our clients, and it's something we map out down the track. And when they're sort of getting to the top of their serviceability and they can't borrow anything more, but maybe they've got that equity sitting there, what else can they do to boost their rental returns? So definitely something we map out.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you mentioned as well regarding serviceability. We find that's a great use case for granny flats because it sounds counterintuitive. I'm loaning money. So if I'm loaning money to build something, how am I increasing my borrowing capacity? Because they're so highly positively geared, the excess income goes back into your bottom line. And so your borrowing capacity, we find often actually increases after the granny flat's been built and rented out after a certain period of time. So that's something a lot of people don't know either.
Yeah. And we've touched on it with some clients recently about potential of buying this type of asset in a trust structure and the benefits that come with that, particularly looking for positive income and cash flow over time. So really interesting chat. I guess we'll leave your details in our show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to part with, whether it's how do people get in contact with you? I know you're obviously big on socials as well, but if any closing comments you'd like, then feel free to leave us with a few.
No, I suppose, look, if anyone is interested in granny flats, and I do suspect there's going to be a ton over the next X period of time, feel free to reach out to me on any of my socials. I'm quite active on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook. Otherwise, I think you guys will sort of post my email address and phone number there as well. Always love to have a chat. I'm really passionate about what I do, so never reject a phone call to chat granny flats.
Very good.
Well, thank you, Theo, or the Granny Flat King, as we should say.
Thank you.
Appreciate having you on the show.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that chat today. As I said, we'll leave some of those links in the show notes. Thanks again to our sponsor, Scale Lending. For those that are looking for a new broker or just maybe a second opinion, feel free to reach out to the team there. But I think that'll wrap things up for today. So I look forward to chatting again shortly.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Melbourne Property Podcast. Just a reminder that this information is general in nature and should not be considered financial advice. If you'd like to discuss your personal situation, book a discovery call with the team at Convergence Buyers Agents. Our link is in the show notes.
If you learned something from this podcast, hit subscribe and never miss your fortnightly dose of Melbourne property insights. Catch you next time, and happy house hunting!